What would you say if I asked you to go on an expedition, one to the very edge of the known world, one where the clean, clear waters of the sea begin to close in completely solid ice? What would you say if I said you have enough provisions to last up to 4 years should something go wrong? After all, should you prove successful, this would mean great esteem for you and your crew. You'll be piloting the finest steamships that science has to offer. These are ironclad, the strongest, most capable ships ever designed. But then what would you say if I told you the ice may close in? It might trap you. It might completely isolate you from rescue. After all, this is what the 4 years of provisions were provided for. But what if I told you when you were trapped in that ice, your ship's unable to move, your stores of food running low, and the constant darkness creeping in all around you? There might be something else out on that ice, something that might want to hunt you and your crew. At some point, you may be forced to choose. Do you face walking out, going in search of rescue? Do you wait for the ice to melt and finally release your ships from their icy grave? Once the stores have run low and starvation finally sets in, your crew has nothing but mutiny in their eyes, and it's all up to you to figure out how to get them out of this frozen wasteland. Does this still sound like an adventure you'd like to sign up for? These are just a few of the topics we're going to discuss today while we talk about The Terror, written by Dan Simmons and narrated by Tom Sellwood. You're listening to The Pageless Library, and thank you for joining me today. If you're new here, welcome. If you're returning here, welcome back. If you're returning here, you also are wondering, why is he talking like that? Why is he talking so slow and dramatic? I'm trying something a little bit new. I think I've said that on every single episode I've recorded lately, but here we are. Got to get a little bit better at my hooks. So that's what I'm working on today. Hopefully it caught your attention, and hopefully you're interested to hear the rest of what I have to say about this book. The Terror, written by Dan Simmons, as I said, was written in 2019. It was published by Little Brown and Company, and this book clocks in at a whopping 28 hours and 28 minutes. I'll also be talking about the book track edition, so hopefully I'll discuss this a lot more later. The book track edition has additional sound effects added into the story in the background of the narration. These are typically very subtle sounds, such as creaking wood in the background while you're on board the ship, maybe crackling ice, wind blowing, or gunshots heard far away. This is not the first book that I've listened to that uses this technique, but this one really stands out to me. I'll talk about that a little bit more once I pass the spoiler wall, but I do think the book track edition adds to the story, in my opinion. I know I have talked to people who do not like any additional sounds added into the audiobook. I happen to really like it in this one. I think it was used very effectively. This book is a historical fiction. It is also a horror book with supernatural and paranormal elements, and I think the book track portion of this was used to great effect to help give you this real feeling of isolation, being trapped, having things surrounding you. I'm not sure exactly how to put this all into words, but if you have like a really good set of headphones and you're listening to this one, you're going to feel like you're being transported to a different place. A lot of the times narrators can do that on their own, but I really do think these additional sound effects were used to great effect, and I think it helps solidify that feeling of isolation that's really trying to be conveyed here. Speaking of the narrator, how does Tom Sellwood do in this performance? Excellent. And I'm almost getting tired of saying that, okay? If I'm being honest, I'm hard-pressed these days to find a bad narrator. And I'm not just saying that. I do think that these narrators have come a long ways, especially in a lot of these productions that are clearly of very high quality. The better the audio equipment quality gets, the more accessible it is for people who choose to become narrators, the better of a product we as the consumers and the listeners are going to get. And I think that that's great across the board. I'm still meaning to put out an episode fully about the idea of fully automated AI voices being used in our audiobooks. I'm going to try not to get into that too much here, but just know that Tom Sellwood does an incredible job here on this one. Unfortunately, Tom Sellwood only has 6 titles available on Audible, which is where I listened to this book from. You can get this in both the book track edition and non-book track edition too, just in case that is something that worries you, that maybe you're not a fan of these books with additional sound effects in the background. I didn't know anything about the author, Dan Simmons, when I went into this one. I bounced off of this book actually twice, to be honest with you. I started listening to it and I got a bit lost in the way it's written. But the story that Dan Simmons has come up with and is conveying here really hits on a lot of levels for me. I'm not sure I've mentioned this before actually on the podcast. I was in the Coast Guard. I served aboard a few ships, so this one might actually hit a bit different for me. Especially having been on board a ship that was actually doing ice breaking, this book really hits on several levels for me. I think it strikes at maybe a pretty deep fear in me. Having been out in completely frozen water, and actually having a relatively traumatic event happening during one of those times, this book really does hit a nerve for me. Several, possibly. I don't want to get too far into that. I guess if anybody has any questions about that kind of stuff that I did, please feel free to email me and let me know, or leave a comment below or something like that, and I can talk about it a little bit more. But yeah, just know that I have a very kind of personal relationship with this book as well, so that might bias my opinion about it, but either way, that's how I feel. I quickly, though, after I listened to this, went and saved several other of Dan Simmons' writing, because I really want to get to know this guy as an author. I found the writing in this one, as I said, it might have been a little bit difficult for me to follow in the beginning, so this will answer some of those big questions while I discuss the author, but it is a little bit difficult to follow. We jump around perspectives quite a bit. We follow quite a few different characters, and there are a lot of characters. We're talking several ships with fully fledged crews, each one of these men unique to the story, and a lot of them having their own screen time, if you will, right in front of our face. It makes it kind of difficult jumping from perspective to perspective, and it happens quite often. There's going to be a lot of nautical terminology used, and it's very well done. It's very clear to me that Dan Simmons really did his research when he wrote this book. But I would definitely say don't go into this one if you're looking for a real easy, relaxing listen. This book is filled with suspense. This book has some absolutely horrifying things that are conveyed. But by the end of the book, there clearly is a lot of deeper meaning here. This is not just meant to be a scary book, haha, I came up with a cool monster to scare you with. This book hits on a lot of different levels, and it should actually make you think and reflect even on what's happening in the world. I don't necessarily think it was meant to be completely psychological, but it really is going to mess with your head. Yes, there is some supernatural elements, but in reality, it's the men that actually are the real monsters in this one. Now, I don't want to get too terribly spoilery, if you want to listen to this one. So I'll give you my overall recommendation on this. As I said, I bounced off of this book a couple times, started listening to it, maybe got an hour or so into it, and I put it back down. I couldn't focus on it. Even when I was driving, I would find myself with my brain wandering, and I'd miss a sentence or two and have no idea what was going on. So just realize that's kind of what you're getting yourself into. But once I actually finished this book's incredible. Okay, I highly recommend this one. I think I could recommend this to anyone. It's going to approach some subject matter that might be really hard for some people to listen to, and understandably. Just be aware that this one's going to approach some very, very dark places. I think overall, though, this book was very unique to me in the setting, in the way it's told, in the undertones of the story, the background of some of the supernatural elements, whether this is all stuff that was actually taken from true historical events, or a lot of this stuff was actually just made up by Dan Simmons. It's incredible to me, the way it all comes together. And I found myself, like I said, very quickly going to look at his other books and see if he had written anything else similar to this, because I really, really enjoyed this book so much that I was very eager to go listen to anything that he had written. Overall, if you're looking for a really deep book that maybe makes you think, and is very genuinely scary at times. I mean, if that's something you really enjoy, I think you can for sure find it here. There's some stuff here that honestly made my skin absolutely crawl. You won't be disappointed if you pick this one up. I promise it's worth your time, and it's definitely worth your money. I'm going to go ahead and give a short summary of the book, so if you don't want anything spoiled for you, please pause the podcast now and go check this one out. I do not think you'll be disappointed. Just do me a favor. If you do go listen to the book, please come back here and hear what I have to say about it. I'm going to give my thoughts about it while I talk about the summary. And if you don't come back, thanks for stopping by. I really appreciate your time. The Terror is actually based on what I'm assuming is a true expedition called Franklin's Lost Expedition. Well, obviously that's what we call it now because it was lost. And I didn't know that going into this, that this is based on a real expedition of two ships, the Erebus and the Terror. Well, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. They were supposed to find the Northwest Passage in the Canadian Arctic. They were basically traveling somewhere north of Canada. Now, this all took place in 1845, so you got to remember these are sail ships, but they are also steam-powered, but this was kind of a newer thing, I think, at the time. Now, the expedition was supposed to just go and chart some uncharted territory and discover this passage, thinking that it would open up, new trade routes and things like that. However, both ships do end up ultimately trapped in the ice, and they're unable to leave, and they spend, I think, at least a year, possibly 2, in the ice. And looking at this stuff now, I'm looking at the Wikipedia article, and I didn't read any of this before I started this episode because I'm a terrible journalist. But it's obvious that Dan Simmons used real locations, real names, and real notes taken from this lost expedition. However, he puts a supernatural twist on this. The men of HMS Terror and HMS Erebus in the story are hunted by a beast on the ice. It's really interesting because at the beginning, they run into a few native Inuit people, and there's some really bad things that happen with them. And it's after their encounter with them that this beast, this large, bear-looking creature, white bear, similar to a polar bear, but almost more with the face of a man, begins hunting the crew. And it's not shy about it. It will take men if they wander too far from the ship, or it will even come on board the ship and attempt to take men. Now, there's one lady that actually stays with them. They call her Lady Silence. She is a native Inuit who has had her tongue removed and she cannot speak. She plays an extremely large role in Dan Simmons' story because by the end, we actually find out that she is the one who saves Captain Crozier, who was originally the captain of the Terror. Ultimately, I think what the story culminates in is that these people went to this area of the world. They went with the most advanced technology that we had at the time, and they couldn't survive. No matter what they did, all of these men perished. Now, this is obviously a real tragedy that happened in real life, but the spin that Dan Simmons puts on it is that there are people who live in that area of the world. There are people who thrive in that area of the world. And we get to see some of that towards the end of the story when Francis Crozier is actually taken in by Lady Silence. After his crew, they all end up kind of going their separate ways. You have men who are starving because a lot of their food rations actually were not stable like they were supposed to be when they set out. We find out that the provisions they were given were actually given to the cheapest bidder, and a lot of the cans were not sealed correctly. A lot of the men end up freezing to death. Obviously, this is solid ice all around them. You're probably talking -degree temperatures for days, if not months on end. Sometimes you wouldn't even see the sun. They were so far north that during certain times of the year, the sun probably wouldn't even barely rise above the horizon before setting again immediately into complete darkness. So a lot of the men end up basically losing their mind. There ends up being essentially a mutiny once the men have finally had enough. Now, there is a bit of cannibalism discussed in this book, which is not something anybody ever wants to hear about, I don't think. I would hope. The sad part about all of this, to me, is that in the story, Captain Crozier actually told Captain Franklin that they needed to abandon the ships once the ships were set in the ice. He also told Captain Franklin that they would end up set in the ice. He knew that if they went to the spot that they got stuck they would get frozen in the ice. And if they had waited, there would have been a much better chance of them actually being able to navigate these passages. So it's really hard to sit and listen because basically in the book, Captain Crozier is seen as being pretty insubordinate because he doesn't want to do what the lead captain, Sir John Franklin, decided they would do. And ultimately it leads to the death of all of their crew because of this, I would actually call it arrogance, essentially. Now, I don't know how closely some of this echoes the true story or what accounts we have of the true story. According to what I can see here online, there's actually only 2 notes that were left at Victory Point by the crew that really is all that tells the story of what happened to these men. Essentially, these 2 ships and all of these men were frozen in the ice and they disappeared. A lot of expeditions were sent afterwards. Both ships were discovered afterwards. But knowing all of this actually makes Dan Simmons' story even more interesting to me. I find it very fascinating when somebody can take something that actually happened in history and put an extremely interesting supernatural twist on it. This is a great idea for a story because there's very limited information on what actually happened to these men. So for him to fill in the blanks with things that he came up with or thought were interesting in his mind really does work for me. So my hat is off to him. I really find this a very interesting story. I find it even more interesting the fact that this is a real event that he's kind of putting his own spin on. Not only is this a horrific story in real life, I mean, he probably didn't even have to add a supernatural element to make it horrific, but he does it really well in this. There is a show also, which is actually why I started listening to this, because I stumbled across the show and I thought it looked interesting, so I started listening to the book. I quickly discovered that while they're similar, they definitely are not exactly the same. A lot of the changes made in the show I was not impressed with, and before I could actually finish the show, they removed it from the app that I was watching on to where you can only watch the first episode for free, and after that you have to pay for the rest of you either have to sign up for the new app that it's on, or you gotta pay for the rest of the episodes. So I have not finished the show. Please, if you have finished the show, let me know how that goes. Thinking about it now, it's actually amazing how interesting this story turned out to be for me. I mean, how interesting can a story be about 2 ships frozen in the ice until all of the men essentially die on both ships? The men ultimately decide they're going to walk out. They're going to walk south over the Canadian tundra, essentially, this completely frozen wasteland. But by this point, when they've decided they're going to walk out, it's pretty much too late. Some of the men decide they're going to head back to the ship, which we find out from Francis Crozier's point of view that also didn't work out very well. Crozier comes back to the ships after he has already basically become one with the Inuit people and discovers that some of those men did make it back to the ship. He thought there was no possible way they were going to, but obviously they're all dead on the ship. They weren't able to actually survive off of the stores that were still there and get out of the whole thing alive anyways. Francis Crozier is the only one in the book who survives the entire thing, and I think that was a great choice. I always like a book where I don't know who is safe, but if there was anyone I really wanted to be safe in this book, it was Francis Crozier. There are several points in the book where I actually didn't know if he was going to be safe, and I really appreciate that. It helps build the tension, and it helps keep the tension. When you don't know if any of these men that you're getting to know are actually going to live or not. There's also a few characters in this book that you may be rooting for them to not live, and unfortunately they might survive much longer than you would really want them to, and they get away with much more things than you'd care to listen to, I'm sure. I don't really think my review does this book justice. This book is just an amazing, interesting, niche novel, at least in my experience. And I really do think you have to experience this one for yourself. Whether that's the book track one or it's just the standard audiobook, I don't think you can go wrong with this one. If you're one of those weird, smart people who can read really well and you can read really fast, then I still think you should read this one. I'm only joking. I just wish I could read. But I'm going to keep this one on the short side. Hopefully I've piqued your interest. Maybe you can look into both Franklin's Lost Expedition as well as check out this book. I really think it's worth your time. I really think it's a unique find, and I really think you're going to enjoy it. Thank you so much for spending some time with me. I know your time is very valuable, and it means the world to me that you choose to spend it with me. So thank you all for listening, and I hope to catch you in the next one.